Have you had moments when the questions lead to another like follow-up? Is it discursive at all, or do you want to really stick to like?
Oh no, it's very much conversation.
Oh, great.
Absolutely. And I think that what they're looking for, and granted, I mean, this is my first night. I
Sure.
just jumped on board, but I think what he is looking for is that it should be, you know, what you're inspired to say
Okay.
that in an honest way. You know, because sometimes, you know, you feel
Yeah.
like you're just kind of getting to something, and then it's like question 4, and
Right.
you know, you stop something abruptly.
Right.
I think it should let it be as conversational as you need it to be.
All right.
And yeah, we're good to go.
Cool.
Okay. So we'll start with number 1. What is your definition of race?
It's so funny that I haven't, you know, I didn't come in with a definition, but I would say partly based on last night's conversation, partly based on like my upbringing or what I've been taught, for me, racism is the intricate and sort of foundational systems at play that privilege one racial group or one cultural background over another. That's the simplest way I can put it.
Right. And that came, but I mean, some of your background is that challenging racism was kind of part of the household.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I think I grew up or maybe understanding whiteness as a constructed race earlier than other white people did because of my parents' background, you know, which was my parents had an interreligious marriage, and there was a lot of fractiousness on both sides about that. And at the same time, it was 1962 and they were becoming engaged in the civil rights movement, and they saw a connection and sort of went from there. I mean, my mom is not as well known, but does a similar kind of speaking as Tim Wise. You know, she speaks at white privilege conferences. She probably did a little calling him out, you know, about the amount of money that he makes for speaking fees and stuff like that. So yeah, it's just been a part of my life, you know, understanding that there is a racist system and a structure.
If you adopted cross-culturally, what would you teach your child about how America sees race?
That's a mind twister. I mean, I would try to teach a kid that they needed to assume their own equality while understanding that other people were assuming they were not equal. I'm really captivated right now by this writer, Jacques Rancière, who talks a lot about people, like the beautiful lie of calling attention to an inequality by playing as if the equality exists, that is supposed to exist. And so I think that's what I would want to give my kid, the strength to understand that there were going to be problems, you know. And I think the other thing I would want to teach him is that we were always there for him, that we were, you know, I don't know if this makes sense, but not visually, but spiritually, we were adopted into his or her culture as well as adopting him into ours. That would be my hope. That would be the bar I would set. Who knows, you know?
Well, I love what Toni Morrison said in that interview, which is she always knew she was morally superior.
Yeah.
And like, that's a good
that
level. That's a great thing to equip a child with.
Right.
Yeah. What's your favorite black movie?
I thought about this when I got the invitation. And I mean, my first impulse is like, well, one of my favorite movies, period, is Do the Right Thing. And I think it's, you know, but I don't, I think of it as a movie about race and gentrification and the issues around New York City and all kinds of things, but I don't think of it as a black movie. I think of it as a New York movie. I also think of that as like, that's one of the best New York movies that exists.
Captured that, yeah.
Yeah, captured a time and a place in a particular way, and hip hop culture and tensions within a black community, not the, you know, I don't really believe that there's one, so, yeah.
What is your favorite white movie?
Annie Hall. Same reasons.
And that's probably safe to call a white movie, right?
Oh yeah, I would say yes. But I'm trying to think because I feel like there are movies that I've responded. Okay, so there's a filmmaker, Jem Cohen, who's a very lesser known filmmaker. He shows at like MoMA and the Tate, and he made a movie called Lost Book Found, which is about sort of like a journal of some sort of misfit that another guy finds and tracks down. And I'm interested as an artist and as a writer and as a city dweller in where misfits are. And Jem is very much like a white filmmaker to me. I don't know that it's a film about whiteness at all. It's actually a film about misfitdom, and I feel like that's something that captivates me. But he is so I don't know. I'm talking myself out of that. I don't think it's a white film, but it is in as much as he's a white filmmaker making a movie about white people. you know.
What is privilege?
Privilege is a lack of limits placed on you from without, and probably from within. You know, there's a level, I'm sure, in which we internalize the limits that are placed on us from without.
So what is white privilege?
White privilege is the lack of limits based on the color of your skin. Yeah.
What's the best part about being identified as white?
These are good questions. The best part? I mean, I would say things are easier. You know what I mean? Like, it's easier to be in this room with this group and be like one of the people. I mean, I don't know if you feel like this, but like one of the people who's done some work on himself. So within a group that's mixed racially, even if I was to say something and be called out for being naive or for being, you know, having internalized something that was racist, like, I'm still farther along than a lot of other white people, and that's easier. Like, I feel like there's an ease to that. So that even though I'm trying to do some difficult work, there's something about it that for me feels easier than, that my walk through life is easier. That I'm in less, and specifically, I'm in less physical danger than an African-American man, my age, stature, class background. You know, less danger of being killed by police, less danger of being killed in any number of ways, being assumed to be someone I'm not. So I mean, that's like, it's a very physical thing, and that actually came from arriving in New York and I feel like I had a very clear understanding of that. That also really, and I think it's true of poverty versus, you know, I think it's true of economic class, but when you couple race with that, it's massively clear. And arriving in New York and getting my first apartment in 1988 in a neighborhood that was largely Latino and Black, there was just this incredibly palpable understanding that I could flag a cop down and my neighbors couldn't. You know, that I was not assumed to be a criminal because of the color of my skin, and that no one wanted to fuck with me because, like, the crack houses didn't want to fuck with me because if they did, there would be cops. And if they fucked with someone else, there wouldn't be, you know? So that was like a very like physical evocation of my privilege.
Do you deal with whiteness in your daily life?
In my daily life, I feel like I'm aware of it. I mean, more and more, I feel like I do place myself in situations where I may not be the majority, or there's enough diversity within the room that I'm in that cultural background is clear, like the differences are clear, or I feel like internally I'm really aware of like when I'm in a room full of white people and it's assumed to be normal. Because to me that's not normal in New York. Like, New York is a diverse city. And I don't know if I was telling you about like going to see a work in progress show of like downtown theater artists in Bushwick. And it was like 105 people stuffed into this little room, and everybody on stage was white except one guy, and everybody in the audience was white except 3 people. And I was like, we're in Bushwick, you know? And so I was really aware of that. And that is really uncomfortable for me. And what is uncomfortable is not being around other white people. I'm totally fine with that. It's being around other white people who aren't perceiving that this might be strange. Like, to me, it's otherworldly that exists, you know?
Is it possible to end white privilege?
I would certainly hope so. I mean, I think that's where this idea of a beautiful lie comes in, is like we have to envision the world that exists without white privilege. Now, the other thing I want to say is that like the population's changing. You know, if white becomes a minority, it will lead to for me, I could see it leading to one of 2 things. One is an end to white privilege in a really mindful and beautiful way, which is what I hope for. And one is like an apartheid state where the white minority clings to its power as long as possible, and that seems ugly. But I'd like to think that we can end white privilege and that we kind of have to.
Well, then in some ways you've made one possible answer, but what would it take to end white privilege?
I think it's back to the Toni Morrison thing of making people who have a certain level of privilege understanding that they're missing something, or that they're losing, that they're victimized is not the right word, but that they may also, it might detract from their life as much as it might give them some access that they may lose.
And that kind of goes to the last question, which is how does racism negatively impact white people? Like, so what is that thing that might...
I see white people, especially younger than me, and especially male, searching for a kind of authenticity that I feel has to do with being white, and looking for like, and a lot of it is class-based. So I see a lot of guys of privilege who are white dressing as if they were working class from the 1940s. And I'm like, what is that? And I used to do it. Like, I used to wear my gas station jacket, like in the 80s, that I, you know, although I cleaned up at a bakery, but I never worked at a gas station. I came from a very like straight up middle class background. And So I feel like that is a search for ownership of identity that to me is a little ludicrous. And I think I feel I'm hard on it because I participated in it, and to some extent probably still do, you know. But that there is this idea that there was a time when we had an authentic and viable culture. And I think it's unconscious, you know, when I go to Williamsburg and I'm like, wow, all these guys in like lumberjack jackets and beards are just, you know, copying a fashion because that's what their friends are doing. But there's something in it to me that's very disturbing, which is like, are you hearkening back to a time when like racism was more overt, or black people couldn't vote, or we did manual labor? Like, what is that about? And I feel like it's a discursive way of saying, I think that's trying to mine that gap, you know, or mine that loss. And I don't know, I do feel like I don't know what it would look like to lose that privilege, in the sense of like, I don't know exactly what we would gain, because I feel like on an internal level, I kind of gain it, you know, like by working on it, you know, then that provides a different access to culture.
Implicit rather than or intrinsic rather than extrinsic.
I feel like the work, I mean, the one thing that this is just, I want to say too, just from these 2 nights, is like the work for me personally I have to be careful about is not just being as upfront about the stuff in this room as I can be in other rooms, you know. I think that's the issue for some of us who are white, who are working on the thing, you know, who are trying to call it out, and it's very easy to call it out in a comfortable, you know, like-minded group of people who will be impressed. And it's harder to do what I wanted to do on this podcast I was telling you about yesterday, you know.
Well, talk about the podcast.
Oh, sure. So I'm on a podcast. There's you know, I work in experimental theater, and there's an artist who I like very much, 2 artists, they're a couple, and they are doing this long-form podcast, 2-hour interviews with artists that they're interested in. And a lot of their work is transcribed phone conversations and things like that. So this is a logical extension. And they had me in, and I recorded, and at a certain point, we started talking about how, and I didn't articulate this as well last night, he was going on about how politics seems separate from art and real life, and that, you know, why couldn't we just be free of politics, and politicians were this other class of people? And I was like, that's a privilege to feel that way. Like if you're a person of color, your every waking moment is overtly political in a way that if you're white you can kind of escape from, although I don't really think you can, but like I think you can feel like you're escaping from it. So this idea of something separate from politics is a privilege that I think mostly white people take on. And he was like, okay, let's move on to the next question, you know. And I thought, afterward I thought, I would have liked to have worried that a little bit more, you know. So that's like the next step.
Great.
That was fun.
That was fun, yeah.
Thanks.